Much today's lecture will be, of course, on the Roman Republic, mostly getting into the later Republic, of course, getting close to the Roman Empire, of course, which is getting pretty much starting to form right now, as we're talking about, because we're right in the middle of the Punic Wars right now. So that's pretty much what we're doing today, more or less, with this lecture I've got. So pretty much where we're at from last time, which of course I talked about was the Punic Wars. That's pretty much where we're at. I know from the previous lecture on I think it was on Monday, and I think we were talking up to the point where the Second Punic War had broken out, and of course Hannibal, if you know about it, went on the offensive after that conflict over Spain. Remember, Spain was the thing that started the Second Punic War, and so Hannibal's forces invaded into northern Italy, which the Romans had a very difficult time trying to trying to fight them. Like, they got routed in multiple battles. I think it was the Battle of Trevi and the Battle of Trasimeno, Lake Trasimeno. I think I may have told you that the Romans, what happened was they tried to go on the offensive, 216. And there were these two generals, Gaius Vero, Lucius Paulus, who were Roman consuls at the time. They led a huge army of Romans, which was something like 90,000 troops, what they think was about 16 legions. So I think each had like about 8 legions among them as a whole. And the Romans tried to trap Hannibal's forces on the bottom of Italy. I think I may have shown this before to you right here, but basically where Cannae is close to the ancient little city there, close to Adriatic Sea, right here. The Romans tried to trap Hannibal at that location, and they thought they had him trapped, more or less. And Hannibal's force were outnumbered. He may have had 40 to maybe 50,000 troops, possibly composed of predominantly infantry. He also had some pike infantry, and then of course his cavalry. And what happened in the battle was that they believe Hannibal had kind of devised some kind of tactic against them, where when the Romans attacked Hannibal's forces in the center, he used a combination of his infantry and cavalry to basically encircle their army. So basically a smaller army encircled a larger army, which it's kind of hard to do, but he did it. Anyway, Cannae is considered to be one of the greatest encirclement battles of all time, at least in ancient times. They also consider it like a double envelopment as well. And so Hannibal's forces went on to crush the Roman army. Half or more of them were killed in the battle. And the Battle of Cannae is considered to be one of Rome's worst military defeats they ever suffered. So you wonder why the Romans hated Hannibal, because of that. Now, even though Hannibal had badly beaten the Romans, he was unable to really defeat the Romans and knock them out of the war. The reason for that is that Hannibal didn't really have the siege equipment to really take Rome, which is a fortified city. He didn't have the number of troops. In fact, he had lost a good amount of troops too, fighting the Romans, like a larger army. And so, in a sense, in Italy, it became kind of a stalemate during the Second Punic War. Neither side could win, and so the Romans went back to that whole thing with using guerrilla tactics, hit and run tactics that Fabius, remember Fabius the Delayer, they called him, had kind of devised, and that's pretty much what the Romans did in Italy. They couldn't really fight him mano a mano, and of course they'd get beat bad. So what happened after that? So the Romans, like I said, the Romans relied more on guerrilla tactics instead, and so what the Romans decided to do, they changed their military tactics, and they decided that the best thing to defeat Hannibal would be to attack other parts of the Carthaginian Empire. And so they, of course, if you know about it, they first attacked Spain, which I guess is part of Hannibal's base in the Western Europe. And so there was a general that was involved in that was really important. His name, of course, was Cornelius Scipio, often called Scipio Africanus. He, of course, ended up being one of the best Roman generals in the Punic Wars. Of course, he's the one that would eventually, if you know about it, defeat Hannibal in the second Punic War. He was called Africanus because of military victories. He was successful with in Africa, like Battle of ZAMA. And so he was called Africanus because means the African, but it basically meant that he was famous for his victories there. They also called him the Roman Hannibal sometimes. I think some people dubbed him that as well. So he was kind of considered Hannibal's equal or Hannibal's rival. And Scipio actually had been on the losing side, like in the battle, I think of Battle of Cannae. I think he was involved in that, by the way. Oh, I forgot to talk about what happened, but with the Battle of Cannae, but Paulus was one of the two generals that had got killed in the battle. He was one of the consuls. He died in the battle, but Scipio was supposedly there, on the losing side if you read about that battle. All right, so yeah, that was really their first successful thing they did. So what Scipio did was he used the Roman Navy to transport, Roman soldiers across the Mediterranean to Spain. And so within a few years, they were able to eventually conquer Spain, which Spain was controlled by Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, who eventually died in the battle, I think in battles against them. He got killed, I think, and eventually from there, Scipio was then able to, from Sicily, they were able to eventually later also take over North Africa. They invaded North Africa at that point. And that's the thing that eventually forces Hannibal to return to Africa when, Scipio's forces began going into to try to take Carthage, try to lay siege to it. And so that would eventually lead to a famous showdown where both those two military geniuses, Hannibal and Scipio, fight it out in October of 202 BC, Battle of ZAMA, of course. And ZAMA, of course, was a famous battle, which was fought like kind of due south of what is Tunisia, where the city of Tunis is, basically. And in this battle, which took place by October 19, 202, they had comparable forces at ZAMA. I think the size of the forces, I'm not mistaken, Hannibal had about 40,000 troops with 80 war elephants, of course, well known. Scipio had about 30,000 troops of cavalry. So I think they I think Hannibal had a little larger force than what Scipio did. But Scipio relied more on better cavalry, and Hannibal tried to rely more on elephants. And that proved to be kind of not very good. And by that time, the Romans had figured out how to fight elephants, which had pretty much became obsolete after that battle. And so ZAMA was one of the last major battles fought in ancient times with elephants, which had been used for a while, going back to, I guess, the Persians and the Greeks and all that. But Hannibal's forces was heavily routed. About half of his force were killed and wounded, and the other half were captured by Scipio. So basically, the Battle of ZAMA, it pretty much decided the whole outcome of the Second Punic War. Rome took over Spain. Carthage became pretty much a weak power after that. Carthage even had to pay a lot of war reparations to the Romans pretty much afterwards. But it is true that it's a true story that Hannibal and Scipio did kind of become friends. I think that's something that Livy kind of talks about a little bit in some of his works. And he talks about how the two actually met each other before the battle. And Scipio was actually in awe of Hannibal. He thought he was a really great commander, even though he was considered like their enemy, that kind of thing. Oh, hey, Claude. Anyway, so we're talking about the Second Punic War. So Scipio Africanus would, defeat Hannibal and later went into exile. Hannibal and actually later kept fighting the Romans till about 183, but he later committed suicide because he didn't want to be captured by him. All that. So we're kind of talking about the Second Punic War right now. Now I need to talk about the other war. They had one more Punic War that they had too as well, which is the Third Punic War. So there's a little slide on there if you want to look at that later. That's about the amount of troops they had, about all that. But the Third Punic War was the last one. This one, of course, led to pretty much the Romans destroying Carthage. That's pretty much what happened with this war. Third Punic War was a decisive war. The Romans just wiped them out. They destroyed what was left of the Carthaginian Empire. They sacked the city, the capital of the Carthage was destroyed. Pretty much broke their back. And why did it happen? They believed that the Third Punic War was caused by mostly the fact that the Romans feared that Carthage would come back. They would kind of come back like they did after the First War. And so that was one reason. And two, the other one you see there on the bottom was that the Romans wanted to take over part of North Africa. That's one of their things that was part of the war. And so a lot of the senatorial class, like the wealthy people in Rome, saw it as a chance to seize a lot of the land that's in North Africa, which they would easily take, more or less. Of course, one of the major figures that was, involved in supporting the idea of the war was Marcus Cato, who's often called Cato the Elder. He was the major backer and war hawk that really wanted the war, more or less. And he's the one that became famous for his quote during the war, or before the war, really, which is Carthago delenda est, which means, of course, Carthage must be destroyed. And this was a famous quote that he started talking about in whatever kind of speech he would be giving. Like he was considered a great orator. Marcus Cato was a politician, lawyer, an orator, speaker. And when he'd be given like a speech about something in the Senate, he would kind of end his speech with this quote, no matter what he was talking about. He could be talking about like raising taxes or something important politically in Rome. And at the end, he would say something like, "Oh, by the way, we need to destroy Carthage." That's what he would say. So Carthage must be destroyed. It was his famous quote he was known for. So yeah, that pretty much is what happened. The Romans later would use that as a pretext, I guess, to eventually invade North Africa. 149, the Carthaginians actually didn't really want to fight. They weren't really interested in that. But the Romans eventually conquered most of North Africa except Carthage. They laid siege to it, which took about 3 years. Almost 3 years that they laid siege to the city. Called often the siege of Carthage from 149 to 146. And apparently they couldn't find any generals that were any comparable, that were competent, that could take the city. And they finally brought up this general named Scipio Aemilianus, who was one of the grandsons of Scipio, and he was able to eventually lift the siege. And Carthage itself was sacked and burned. It was actually destroyed over like a week or so. And I think at that time that Carthage had maybe a population of like 500,000, possibly, and close to 80% of them were wiped out in the siege when they basically attacked and got burned. The rest were all enslaved. Is what happened to them, they think. So that's kind of a tragic story, about what happened to Carthage. Of course, today, if you go to like the city where the city of Tunis is, the capital of Tunisia, you can, of course, still see the ruins of Carthage, and most of it's just like a bunch of burned out buildings and ruins that are pretty much left there right now. Here's, of course, another aerial view of the size of the actual city that was destroyed. And we're talking about like an area that's like about, they say, 50 square miles. It was a huge city. It was like just one part of it. you're kind of looking at right here. I think it was like, what was it? 32,000 acres was about the size of what they think Carthage was. Yeah, 500,000 people. It's a lot of people, all that. And there's a famous story that they always talk about with Carthage. That's that the Romans took the land, they plowed it under, you know about this, and then they took salt and they salted the earth. You've probably heard that story before, but it's actually, they think, not true. I think it's like this legend that kind of became popular in modern times. They don't think it ever happened, more or less. They actually came back, the Romans, later, and they kind of rebuilt a new city nearby, which I think they called it Carthage too, as well. But it's not the same Carthage as the original one. It became like a Roman version. So that's basically what happened to Carthage. So basically, if you study about that period, they think that the Punic Wars was one of the main things that would cause the decline of the Republic and lead into the Roman Empire. And basically, as the Romans are conquering pretty much like the Carthaginian Empire, they're starting to conquer the rest of the whole Mediterranean Sea. They start marching into Greece. They take that over. They take over Turkey. They take over Syria. Eventually, they'll take over where Israel is. Then lastly, they're going to take over Egypt as well. Later, they take over Gaul, which is France, and then they have Britain. That's like all the main areas that they'll eventually conquer, which is a massive area, 2-3 million square miles. The Romans later called the Mediterranean Sea, they call it Mare Nostrum, which means our sea, or if you want to say our lake. And sometimes people joke that the Mediterranean Sea was like a Roman lake, which it was for many centuries. So let me get into next. I want to talk about, of course, what caused the Roman Republic to decline. There's a couple reasons why the Roman Republic declined and it became an empire. They always say it collapsed. It didn't really collapse. It just became something else, like Roman Empire, with monarchs like emperors reigning over it. But what really caused the decline of the Republic was the rise of these dictators that would eventually take over the state, like Julius Caesar, obviously the most famous, Gaius Marius, Marcus Crassus, Gnaeus Pompey, Octavian. You probably heard of. You may have heard of Sulla and Marius. Those guys. Those are all famous dictators. Mark Antony, of course, you've heard of him too, as well. And they think that these dictators eventually caused numerous civil wars, especially in the first century. They had like 4 civil wars at least they had. That laid the foundation for these dictators to evolve eventually into like an emperor, which is what happened. And that happened over like a period of like something like, I want to say 60 years that occurs. So anyway, I want to get into and talk about some of these men that were real powerful within the Republic that basically lead to eventually the Republic becoming more like an empire with a monarch. And of course, one of the first they always talk about is Gaius Marius, who was really one of the best great generals that really had been since the Punic Wars and all that. He's a really great general at the turn of the second into the first centuries BC. He was actually voted at one point Roman consul like 7 times. In fact, there was one case where he was Roman consul like 5 times in a row, which is, by the way, a record. Anyway, he is very important. I think Marius was one of the first men that really helps to cause why the Republic starts declining. And a lot of it had to do with his reforms. One thing he was known for, Marius was famous for his so-called Marian reforms that they call, where he professionalized the Roman army, which was kind of starting to evolve at that time. Before, armies were more like citizen type style armies, kind of like before. It was like militias. They kind of were, which were based on your wealth. In fact, they would rank people, I think, from, I want to say, 1st to 5th class. And those that were at the top, like 1st class was like the wealthiest, and all the way down the bottom to the 5th class. Back in battles, what they would do? They put the guys like the 5th class first. Let them get killed. So the poor guys get killed first, that kind of thing. Then what happened was, if you know about this, Marius was the one that allowed any male citizen to join. No matter, how much wealth you had, or if you had any land or whatever, you didn't have any land, no matter. Basically, they actually think that was one of the major causes of why the Republic declined. Why is that a big deal? Because of the fact that what happened later was that it made the soldiers more loyal to the general than to the state. Okay, because the generals were the ones that paid the troops, and they also equipped them as well. So the state didn't do that. They didn't do any of that. The generals did that, and so that's why the Romans were always fighting these wars, conquering all these territory and so on, because they can get money out of that and pay their troops, etc. Also, Marius was the one that developed the Roman legions the way they are later. He developed what they call the cohort, or cohort legion, I think they call it sometimes. And the cohort was the main fighting force or fighting unit that was in a Roman legion. Roman legion has about 4,800 men in it, and a cohort has about 480 legionnaires, or infantry foot soldiers. So basically what that means is that there's 10 cohorts in a legion. So, 10 times 480 is 4,800 men, right? And then he also broke down the cohort. He took 480 men and he divided them to what they call 6 centuries. A century is basically 80 soldiers or 80 legionnaires that's in a unit. So it's like they're trying to break down units here. And it's kind of like that they have later in modern times, how they break armies down. The Romans were one of the first to actually do that. They even have officers and things like that. Like a centurion is, of course, an officer of a century. Of course, and all that. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So basically, the Roman armies, they weren't paid by the state. It was all basically done by the commanders, and all that. And so that's why they were in this continued warfare, to pay their armies. That's the amount of years that a soldier had to serve. So about 16 years you would serve, and then you'd go into reserve for a few years after that. And I think the typical Roman soldier might serve like 20 years in the military. I think cavalry was less. I want to say it was like maybe 16 or 15 or whatever. But that's basically, and of course, if you don't get killed. And suppose a lot of times after you would serve, they would even give you like land or something like that. They would give soldiers, if they served so many years, is one thing they would do, the state. All right. Now, Marius was also opposed by this other general they had named Cornelius Sulla, who was a younger man compared to him. He became the up-and-coming general. So he gets opposed by this guy, who's actually, of course, a Roman senator too, as well, like he is. And so it eventually leads to open civil war between them, because both of them start fighting over like who's going to fight in a war and all that, because you got these two rival generals that you've got. And so it leads to what they call Sulla's Civil War, which was fought in the 80s BC, from about 88 to about 82 BC. And Sulla fought to control the Roman Republic. As Marius is kind of getting old at that point, he's kind of declining at that point in age and all that. And so those two fight it out. And at the beginning of the war, what ends up happening is that Marius is actually exiled, and then eventually dies of natural causes. He dies out. He's dead. And so that allows Sulla to kind of take over the state. And the Senate basically declares him like a dictator. And so what ends up happening for about 3 or 4 years, Sulla ends up, of course, becoming a Roman dictator. So Sulla is really the first official dictator at that time that really takes power. And he's kind of like this precursor to like a Julius Caesar later, they think. But he retired. That was the only thing different about, I guess, Sulla versus, say, Julius Caesar later was that, Sulla stepped down after a few. He was only supposed to be temporary, I guess, until things. That's actually why they had the dictator. It was actually to kind of, stabilize the state, and then they'd go back to the way the republic was before. But that's not what Julius Caesar does. It's almost like more like a monarch. So what's going to happen later is that the rise of the dictatorship is going to lead even to like what they call a triumvirate. It'll kind of follow later. where you have this three-man dictatorship that kind of follows next. And they had two of these. They had the first triumvirate that formed first, and later they had a second one called the second triumvirate. First triumvirate formed in 60 BC. It was between three men, three Roman senators who were also generals, Gnaeus Pompey, Marcus Crassus, and Julius Caesar, those three. And so a three-headed monster, I think, is sometimes what people joked about. They called it. Very ambitious men, of course. They formed this kind of alliance together to basically control the state, more or less. Caesar had a lot of popularity. People loved Caesar, Julius Caesar. He was very popular with people. Was a great legal mind. He was also a writer. I think he wrote some history, Caesar. Crassus, Marcus Crassus, of course, was a very wealthy man. He came from the equestrian order, which I told you was that upper middle class they had between the patricians and plebes. Pompey was also a famous general, too, as well. He, of course, was actually supposed to be the best general at the time, they say. Also was pretty wealthy as well. And talk about the first two there. The first two, Pompey and Crassus, if you talk a little bit about them, they became very well known due to putting down the Spartacus revolt. The Spartacus revolt was this slave revolt that broke out in Rome in 73 BC. It was also called the Third Servile War. It was started by this ex-gladiator named Spartacus. He was from Thrace, just like in the northern Aegean. He'd been, I think, captured or something like that. And anyway, he eventually broke out of his gladiator school in what is Capua. He formed an army of slaves, basically, and fought like numerous Roman armies. Actually won several battles, but eventually they killed him in, I think 71 BC. And that's why they became famous. Pompey and Crassus, supposedly at the time, for put it down. I think especially Pompey, I think, more than anything. Caesar, though, Julius Caesar was a nephew of Gaius Marius. He was actually related through his aunt married. His aunt married her, I believe. That's correct, if I'm not mistaken. And anyway, basically, he went on to become one of the greatest Roman generals of all time. He was, considered one of the greatest conquerors they had overall. And what happened was in the 50s BC, Julius Caesar became very famous for his conquest of France, which the Romans called Gaul. And this was part of a series of wars that were called the Gallic Wars. The Gauls were a type of people in Western Europe that were kind of similar to the Celts. And so I think the Romans were kind of concerned that they might attack them or something like that. They saw it as an opportunity to expand their empire. And so he eventually invaded it over a period of like 6-7 years or so. He eventually conquered it. And he was considered, by the way, one of the greatest conquests ever done by a single general. And it resulted in something like 1 million casualties, like 1 million being killed in the war. And I think they captured another 1 million people as slaves, which made him very wealthy. Caesar went on to also invade Britain as well, which he did twice. And then he also invaded Germany as well. He crossed the Rhine River, actually building a bridge across it. He was the first to bridge it. I told you Caesar was a writer. He did write various historical works. His most famous work he wrote was called the Commentaries on the Gallic Wars, which were written when he was on a campaign in Gaul. And it basically was a series of books that was correspondence about his campaigns, how successful he was. He wrote it, he was published it back in Rome to kind of, I guess, show how great he was as a general. And it made him like real popular. So the lower classes really loved Julius Caesar. They thought he was a great man. And but a lot of the upper class didn't like him and all that. So like the 1% or whatever it was that controlled Rome and all that. But he was a household name. Julius Caesar becoming more and more popular at that point. And so a lot of the other more wealthier Romans start kind of worrying that he's going to eventually, take over the whole empire, pretty much. So, anyway, so that's basically what's going to happen, with that, with those two. And now, what's going to occur, of course, that this particular state won't stay together. The first triumvirate only lasts about 7 years. It's eventually going to collapse. Is one of the things that's, of course, going to happen. And what occurs is, of course, civil war breaks out again in the 40s BC. Why is that? I'll get into it. But what happens at that point is that what occurs is that the first triumvirate would break up. Basically, would break up. And Marcus Crassus, who was one of the other guys that was in the first triumvirate, he actually decided he was going to go on campaign and fight in the east, try to get glory, because Caesar's, in Gaul at this point. So he goes and he fights the Parthian Empire. And I think what is Syria, he gets killed in battle. I think they talked about that in the little short video I showed you at the beginning. And so it leaves only 2 men left, which is basically, Caesar and Pompey at that point. So you got these now opposite rivals. And remember, Pompey was originally Caesar's son-in-law. He had married his, Julius Caesar's daughter, but the daughter had died. Like basically, I think that was one of the things that happened. I know it was kind of a thing that broke him apart. But basically, I guess he wasn't anymore, ex-son-in-law, because she had died. And so one of the things that happened was that Pompey, who had been kind of more of a supporter with Caesar, broke from Caesar. And he actually was, at that point, being supported by the Senate. The Senate basically wanted him to be sole ruler of Rome as consul. And so Caesar at that point was kind of concerned that if he disbands his army, which they demanded at that point that he basically come home and disband his army, Caesar decided to defy Rome and go ahead and invade Italy at this point. And so what happens between 50 to 49 BC, Caesar marches his army towards Italy. And in January of 49, one of the things that Caesar does, of course, is he crossed the Rubicon River. The Rubicon was a river in the northern part of Italy. It was like on the border. That was considered the northern border of Italy at the time. And when he crosses the river, that's what sparks the Civil War, often called Caesar's Civil War at that point. And Julius Caesar at that point made a famous quote that's well known. He said, basically, the die is cast. If I don't succeed here, I'll be dead. Pretty my career will be dead. And so he realized that there's no turning back. Once he crossed the Rubicon, and what he means by the die is cast, he's rolling the dice. He's gambling by doing this, by crossing the Rubicon. A lot of people think that that's the thing that really helps to end the whole republic. When he does this, it totally changes everything. And so Caesar's actually going to go on to eventually conquer the whole republic and defeat Pompey's forces. And Pompey at that point didn't really have enough forces to really fight Caesar in Italy. And so what happened was he fled to Greece to get away from Caesar so he could get more reinforcements at that point. And so Caesar takes advantage of that, takes control of Italy. Caesar basically is declared dictator, which he eventually will become pretty much later. And then from there, he begins racing around the whole republic, trying to basically take control of different aspects. Like in Spain, they had a revolt, so he went there, took that. Later, he'll take over Turkey. And then later, of course, Caesar will also take over parts of also North Africa. And eventually in August 9th, 48 BC, both sides, Caesar and Pompey, would fight it out at the Battle of Pharsalus, which is in northern Greece. And Caesar was actually outnumbered. Pompey had way more forces than Caesar did, but his forces were way better. And also Pompey's force didn't want to fight. A lot of them really didn't want to fight each other, and so Caesar's force routed them. I think most of their forces were actually captured by Caesar's forces. Like Pompey's force actually basically surrendered pretty much after the battle. But Pompey himself got away. He fled eventually to Egypt, where he hoped to get some refuge from the Ptolemaic ruler in Egypt at the time, who was King Ptolemy the 13th. They thought he'd be maybe sympathetic toward him, maybe anti-Roman or whatever. But when he got there, Ptolemy the 13th was kind of concerned that the Romans would, conquer their state or whatever. And so they actually had him assassinated. They killed him, cut his head off, and they basically gave the head of Pompey to Caesar when he entered Egypt, which he wasn't, by the way, too happy about that. Later, Caesar enters Egypt, and what happens was, instead of being friendly toward Ptolemy the 13th, who killed Pompey, he actually aligns with Cleopatra, who was the sister of Ptolemy the 13th. They formed this kind of political military alliance against her brother. She was actually co-ruling with her brother, Ptolemy the 13th, Queen Cleopatra, but he wouldn't let her rule, like have any political power or anything like that. And so it eventually led to like a civil war in which Julius Caesar backed Cleopatra and all that. That allowed her to eventually take over as sole ruler of Ptolemaic Egypt, which she'll reign to about 3130 BC. So, and Caesar and Cleopatra were lovers. She was kind of like his mistress for a bunch of years. And they did have actually one son together, who was later named Caesarion, they called him. So Caesar then went on to conquer the rest of the Republic. If you look at this map here, you can see that's the extent of basically Caesar's conquests, pretty much part of Spain, France, Italy, Greece, Turkey, Syria, and of course North Africa. All that was conquered in a short time, pretty much. So that was all pretty much done very quickly, more or less. And the Romans were fearful that what would happen, I don't know what happened, was kind of went out there. Connect back in. I don't know what happened there, but what happened, they thought that basically that Caesar was going to become like a king at that point. And anyway, they decided they were going to kill him. If you know about this. And so it led to this vast conspiracy at that point, which I'll kind of talk a few minutes about, more or less, that they have, occur. And where was I right here? Trying to find it. And I got messed up when that went out for some reason. But I forgot to talk about this, but Caesar basically had mopped up so much, taking over the Republic, that he remarked in a letter to the Senate, Veni Vidi Vici, which of course means I came, I saw, I conquered. And so pretty much within a year or so after that, he's pretty much dictator for Rome, which eventually the Senate makes it, I think at first 10 years, and then over time, it'll be for life. It's one of the things that happens with this. And so, these, a lot of senators kind of get concerned here that it's kind of turning into a monarchy. Some people start calling him Rex, king, at that point. A lot of people start thinking that traditionally that the traditional Roman Republic is dead, overall. And so a ring of senators that are called the liberators form at that point. They conspire to kill Julius Caesar, which happens on the so-called date of Ides of March, which is now known, of course, as March 15th, 44 BC. Ides of March, by the way, means the middle of March, because at the time, the Romans had the Julian calendar had just been brought in by Caesar. And basically, in most Roman months, that they had a middle date, which was the 15th, And so March 15th was the middle of March. Of course, there's an old saying that they used to say about, that date, beware of the Ides of March. They believed the conspiracy, by the way, the liberators, some were like these guys, Gaius, Cassius, Longinus, Marcus, Brutus. These are all men that were supposedly conspired to kill Julius Caesar. They actually were his friends, but they also were friends with Pompey. They kind of all knew each other and all of that. And the assassination itself took place not in the Roman Senate or near the Roman Senate. It was actually near what is the Theater of Pompey, like in an annex going into it. And sometimes the senators would meet there instead of the Roman Senate. And so on that date, March 15th, 44 BC, what happened was when Caesar was walking into the Theater of Pompey in the annex, a bunch of the senators came up to him. They were the conspirators. And they began trying to ask him about a petition they had that they wanted him to sign. And he tried to walk away, and they grabbed him by his toga. They began stabbing him. And of course, they say he was stabbed something like 23 times. And eventually, I think they seem to think that Marcus Brutus may have been one of the ones the last one that actually stabbed him. And so that's why Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar, there's a quote in there where Brutus supposedly said, "Et tu, Brute," and you, my son, or and you, Brutus. But they're not sure if that was really said or not. There's different theories on it. But Suetonius said that he may have actually said, "You too, my son," which I kind of said, which may be correct. But some historians say that he didn't say anything. So that's also, I don't know what you would say when you're getting stabbed, 20-something times. I don't think you'd be saying anything, except maybe screaming or whatever. But I seriously doubt you'd have time to say much, that kind of thing. So anyway, what happened was this Caesar's death caused huge riots, like in the city, like parts of the city were actually burned down because people, were angered about what the liberators thought they were doing the right thing. They had turned out it's not the right thing to do to kill him. They were actually chased out of town. Even their homes were all burned down, supposedly, and it actually caused a civil war later on. That was called it was called the War of the Liberators, or Civil War of the Liberators. That was kind of sparked afterwards, pretty much. And so a lot of historians seem to think that Caesar's death, in a sense, is one of the things that really, it precipitates, like I said, the end of the Republic. Some people put the end of the Republic at that date, 44 BC, although some people think it's actually 27 BC. So it's kind of a debate about when it ends, but they do think of the death of Caesar as one of the major causes of what caused the end of the old Republic. Anyway. Now, what happens afterwards is that what occurs next is that Caesar's got this nephew he's got named Octavian. And he's actually a grandnephew. Octavian is going to eventually seize power and take control of Rome. Is one of the things that he's going to do. He was actually made Caesar's basically adopted son, and he even got his name. He was, I think, afterwards he got the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, but it was kind of shortened to Octavian. And he was able to seize power by forming an alliance with two of Caesar's generals. One, of course, Mark Antony, who was very famous, and then also Marcus Lepidus. What happened was it led eventually to a dictatorship, three-man dictatorship like the first one was in 60 BC. It was founded in 43 BC, and it was known as the Second Triumvirate, as they call it. People pretty much knew about that one. I think the first one was more secretive, I know. And one of the reasons why they formed was to get rid of the liberators who had sparked all this chaos after killing Caesar. And so, like I said, it led to that war I told you about. The War of the Liberators would drag on from about 43 to about 42 BC. Most of them were actually hunted down and killed, or they killed themselves. One of the two. However, like the first triumvirate, which is really weird, the second one only lasted 7 years. It's weird about that. They both lasted only 7 years. That's an unlucky number, I guess, back then. And anyway, what happened was Marcus Lepidus was kind of pushed out. He was kind of seen as the weaker link of the two. And so what happened afterwards was that Octavian and Antony then formed this dual dictatorship to control the state. And what happened was Octavian controlled the western half, controlling like Spain, France, Italy, and part of North Africa. And then Antony controlled pretty much like Greece, Turkey, Syria, were the main areas that he kind of ruled over more or less. And yeah, it was an uneasy alliance. They did have this deal where Mark Antony married like Octavian's sister. Her name was Octavia. However, when he went to the east, Queen Cleopatra came to meet him because she was kind of concerned about her state and what was going to happen to it. And the two had already met before, previously when Cleopatra came to Rome. But the two fell in love. They eventually married, and they eventually also had like 3 children together. I think 2 daughters and a son. And that created a big scandal. If you know about it, it really made Octavian and the Senate really mad. And they got basically concerned that they thought that, they thought that Mark Antony and like Cleopatra were kind of conspiring to take over the empire and rule the eastern part of the empire from Egypt and all of that. And so they thought it was like treason and all that. Also, Octavian wasn't too happy that he dumped basically his sister for Cleopatra. I don't think he was too happy about that either. And so what happened was Octavian and the Senate declared war on Antony and Cleopatra. And it led to another civil war, like one of the last civil wars, of course, that they would have, which was called different names. It was lasted about 32 to 30 BC, somewhere around that time was how long it lasted. It was called different names, though. Antony's Civil War was one name they called it. Some people also call it the Final War of the Roman Republic, the Last War of the Roman Republic. I don't know if there's really an official name. I think some people call it Octavian Civil War, too, as well. So it's got all kinds of names. They dub it. And what happened was Octavian's forces invaded Greece first. And the Romans on the Octavian side had a really good general. His name was Marcus Agrippa. He would later be like a Roman consul under Octavian. And I think he was at the time. And anyway, he basically was able to eliminate Antony's and Cleopatra's naval force at the Battle of Actium. That was really the only major battle that was really kind of important that was fought in that last war, which happened in September of 31 BC off the coast of what is Greece. And after that, it basically allowed Octavian under Marcus Agrippa to eventually invade the eastern area. So they took over Turkey, Syria, and then by 30 BC, they marched into Egypt, took Egypt. And what happened eventually was that Mark Antony eventually killed himself. He committed suicide because he didn't really want to get captured. And although he didn't quite die, if you know about that, he took his sword and he supposedly ran it through himself and killed himself with the sword. But he actually later died in Cleopatra's arms. But Cleopatra actually was captured by Octavian when he took over Egypt. And she was actually going to be brought back to Rome in like a victory parade. But Cleopatra supposedly committed suicide via some kind of poisonous snake. At least that's according to the writer Plutarch. So after that, Octavian basically took over the whole Roman state. That's one of the things that really comes about because of what happened with the Second Triumvirate. The fact that basically there's Cleopatra. She's actually called Cleopatra the Seventh. So they actually called her. she actually commits suicide in 30 BC. And so she's really the last link there with Mark Antony that really can stop Octavian at that point from taking over, the state, the whole thing pretty much. And so what's going to happen is they believe around 27 BC, the Roman Senate decides to give Octavian this new title that's Augustus. And so, his full name was actually Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, but they later call him for short Caesar Augustus. So here it's the name. And he actually becomes the first Roman emperor, they think, and rules for about 41 years. And Octavian, of course, or Augustus is basically seen as the founder of the Roman Empire, which will last around 500 years, 27 BC to 476. So he's the one that pretty much initiates it, the Roman Empire, at least officially with a monarch. Probably Julius Caesar would have if he wouldn't have been killed. Caesar was never like a monarch, but I think he was the prototype to it, and he kind of continued it. All right, let me go ahead and do a review here today, of course. We haven't really gotten any review, of course, on the Roman period, but let me go ahead and talk about this, of course. Around what river was Rome founded in the 8th century BC? That, of course, was the Tiber River. What famous hill was the location where Rome and Romulus and Remus founded the city? The Palatine Hill. Romulus actually built it first originally. What is the date of the founding of Rome? Traditionally, it's put at 753 BC, but it's probably mythological. They're not really sure what date it is, but that's the official date, 753 BC. What famous historical work and its author chronicles the Roman history from the founding of the time of Julius Caesar? That's Livy, who wrote the history of Rome. He's like got one of the most extensive works ever written about, of course, the Roman history early on from the monarchy through the Republic. So Livy's history of Rome. What was the epic of the Aeneid about, written by the Roman poet Virgil? The Aeneid is an epic poem about the Trojan hero named Aeneas. Aeneas was like a cousin of King Priam. It talks about his adventures throughout the Mediterranean Sea, about how he ends up in Italy and helps found like future Roman cities. What author wrote a series of biographies chronicling the lives of the noble Romans, the impact of the monarchy in the Republic of Rome? That, of course, is Plutarch. He was a Greek writer. What was a famous Roman symbol that meant bundle of rods, or just bundle really, and it symbolized the power of like the throne or like magistrates? The fasci. What year did Rome form its republic? 509 BC. What woman's rape spurred on a revolution led by Brutus, the early Brutus, that abolished the monarchy for a republic? That was the rape of Lucretia. What does SPR represent? SPR was the nickname for the Roman government. I guess they call it the Roman state. That it meant Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate of the Roman people. What were the two main social classes of Rome? What assemblies did they use to address their political social ambitions? The two main ones were the patricians, which were the upper class, and they had the plebeians, that was the common people. You also had the equestrian class. It was kind of a rich upper middle class in between. The patricians had this Roman Senate. The plebeians had the plebeian consul, or plebeian assembly, usually consul. What were these magistrates famous for under the Roman government? The Roman consul was the highest elected magistrate. There were two of them, which had veto power. They had legislative, judicial power. They also were commanders-in-chief of the armies. Praetors were like these judicial officials and judges, lawyers that were in the Roman state. Censor was a type of political position that was 5 years. The censor dealt with the Roman censorship. They also were involved in construction projects like public works. Quaestor was like a judicial official. Excuse me, it was a financial official. Excuse me, that dealt with money. like taxation and things like that. And it was a lower magistrate. The first three are all higher magistrates. What was the nickname for the historical period when the plebes got more social rights and all that? The conflict of the orders, or the struggle of the orders, which happened in the 400s BC. The plebes went on strike to get more power. What political magistrates were associated with the plebes and they're protecting their rights and all that? The tribune, plebeian tribune. What was the civic center of Rome? And many cities had something similar to that. The one in Rome, of course, called the Roman Forum or Great Forum. What were the Punic Wars? The Punic Wars were a series of three wars that were fought between the Roman Republic and the Carthaginian Empire. What was the Carthaginian Empire? It was a multi-ethnic empire that controlled parts of North Africa. It was believed to have been founded by the Phoenicians about the 9th century BC. They controlled North Africa, Spain, and part of the islands around Italy, like Sicily. Where was it located in the modern Mediterranean basin? It was located in North Africa, where Tunisia is, and the capital of Carthage was where Tunis is today, like the ruins. What's the origin of the word Punic? Punic, of course, is the old Roman name for what they called the Carthaginians. They call it Phoenician or Phoenician Wars. And Punic came from the Latin word punicus, or the Greek word, which is punici. Who are some famous ancient historians that wrote about the wars? The most famous was Livy, who wrote about the Second War, which is the War of Hannibal. They also had Polybius, who had the oldest series of books called the Histories of Polybius, written about 2nd century BC. They also had Appian, but he was writing later during the 2nd century AD. So I wouldn't worry about him as much. What else? What caused the First Punic War to break out? What was its main outcome? It was caused by the conflict over Sicily. And eventually, during the war, the Romans would seize Sicily, along with Corsica and also Sardinia. That was the main outcome, pretty much, of the war. In fact, the Romans won all three wars, pretty much. Why is the Second Punic War the most famous of these three wars? It was the bloodiest. Close to 1 million people or more died in the Second Punic War. And it was famous for Hannibal. Who was Hannibal? What was he famous for? Hannibal, of course, was a Carthaginian general. He was considered to be the father of military strategy. He was known for invading Italy. What caused the Second War to break out, the Second Punic War? Both the Romans and the Carthaginians got in a conflict over the issue of Spain, like who should control it. And Hannibal had sacked one of the cities in Spain that sparked it, like a pro-Roman city. What was famous about Hannibal's invasion of Italy in 218? He used a huge army, which had infantry, cavalry, and elephants, and he crossed the Alps, which nobody had ever done before. And what famous battle did Hannibal wipe out an entire Roman army? The Battle of Cannae. What famous strategy did Hannibal use in the battle? He used an encirclement technique, or what they call a double envelopment, and that's where you encircle an entire army, which he did with a smaller army. What was the famous quote that Romans used to say about Hannibal? I forgot to talk about that. Or actually, I did talk about that last lecture, I think on Monday. The Romans used to say that Hannibal's at the gates. What famous general eventually defeated Hannibal? Scipio, or Scipio Africanus, or Cornelius Scipio if you want. Scipio, just for short. So General Scipio, what different strategies did he develop that forced Hannibal to return to Africa? Scipio attacked Spain and took that, and then he also invaded Africa. That forced Hannibal to return to Africa for those two to fight eventually over time. What battle did he defeat Hannibal? That was the Battle of Zama, which is in North Africa. That was an interesting battle because of the fact that it was one of the last ancient battles where elephants fought, were used in battle. And also, I think it was famous for Hannibal and Scipio meeting each other. I think these other ones I probably won't review because I just did all that. So it's kind of like redundant that I do all that. So I need to go ahead and move on, at least for a few minutes. I want to go ahead and just talk about the beginning of course, the Roman Empire, which you see right here. Of course, the Roman Empire goes from the time of Augustus, who takes power, and it goes all the way up to 476 when the Western Empire fell. It collapsed at that point. And of course, Augustus was the one that came in. He was the first Roman Empire, Roman emperor that would seize power eventually. And talk a little bit about, of course, Augustus overall, about him. Now, like I said, he would come to power. He's known as Caesar Augustus or Emperor Augustus, either one that they call him. Of course, like I said, the Roman Empire would last until 27 to 476 BC. And he reigned by different names. If you know about it, he got the title Augustus in 27 BC, which is a title that kind of means the venerable or the illustrious one. Is kind of what it means. And it means kind of like he's a great man is kind of what it means. But he hated the title. He couldn't stand being called Augustus. And they gave him this other title that he had too, that he preferred, which was Princeps or Princeps Civitas, which meant basically first citizen. So he liked that title better. And it seemed like it was more like something that was less, regal. He didn't want it to seem like it was a monarch because he wanted to kind of, I guess, create this pretext that the republic still existed the way it was before, the old republic. But it really didn't. It was a monarchy is what it really was. And so, yeah, that's something, that people don't have to realize at this point, that he's really becoming a monarch, an emperor. And but the people later, like the later, successors to Emperor Augustus, were actually called a Caesar, which of course evolves from his, family name, from the name Julius Caesar and all that. Of course, that's what they call a lot of the emperors. And of course, if you read the Bible, they always use that term, Caesar, when they're talking about any emperor at that time. I guess when the Bible's around. Those are the different historians that wrote about the different emperors in Rome. And I'll kind of just briefly talk about them real quick. But basically, you got three different authors that really give us information about basically the Roman emperors, especially around the late 1st century, early 2nd century CE. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio. Those are the ones where we get most of our information. Plutarch a little bit too, I think, as well. But those three are the most famous that you have. And really the one in the middle, which is Tacitus, is the greatest historian that the Romans ever had. He was their greatest writer. I think he wrote the most books more than anything. And Suetonius became famous for his book, The 12 Caesars, which was actually 12 books, which covered from like Julius Caesar up to the Flavian dynasty, which I'll get to later in the 1st century CE. He lived about the turn of the 2nd century, basically. Tacitus, of course, wrote a bunch of books, the Annals of Rome, the Histories of Rome. He's also got a biography called The Life of Agricola, who was his father-in-law. Agricola was a Roman general that conquered Britain, which is a little later. And Cassius Dio is another writer who wrote a book called, I think it's called Historia Romana, or Roman history as well. But Tacitus, like I said, was the greatest writer that really existed, more or less. So kind of giving you some background on some of these writers that they have that are very famous. I'm probably going to quit here for now, but I'll talk a little bit later about Augustus. Augustus, the period of Augustus is going to be called, of course, the so-called Age of Augustus, that they'll nickname it. So it's a golden age. The golden age of Rome is the peak of the Roman Empire that kind of starts here. I'll get into, of course, the Pax Romana. I'll talk about the Julio-Claudian dynasty that exists. I'll probably talk about the rise of Christianity, and I'll probably talk about some of the other dynasties that come later within, of course, the Roman Empire. So before I go, did want to remind you, don't forget, you do have some assignments, of course, that are due coming up. You got to start working on that, second exam. A lot of you have not started on that yet, so that's something you need to really start working on because that's due next week. And you also have the Ancient India quiz, which you need to wrap up to also this week as well. So that's it for today. pretty much. Like I said, I am going to have this lecture on my YouTube channel a little later. So if you got any comments, questions, let me know about it. If you have a comment about the class, some kind of administrative thing, you can email me, of course, later. So y'all take care. Hope y'all have a good rest of the week. But Friday, I'll have a continued lecture, I guess part 3, coming up about the Roman Empire, really, of course, we'll be getting into. So that's it for today. Y'all take care and have a good rest of the week. Okay? So take care.